Everybody. Welcome to another episode of Age of Quarantine. My name is Chris Enriquez. I work at Revolver Magazine and I play in the band Spotlights. And I started the show back in March. Thank you to St. Vitus for letting me have my show on their channel, and for everybody that's been supporting the show Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. And we had some issues with the internet on Wednesday with Ritchie from Into Another and Underdog, and there was a storm here on the East Coast, and we rescheduled for tonight. And I'm so happy that he decided to do this with me. Ritchie is one of my favorite vocalists. He's been around the New York scene for decades. The guy was, like I said, the guy sang in Underdog and is Underdog's still around. Into Another's still around. They got back together a few years ago and put out a great record called Omens, and they've been touring a lot, and they've played at St. Vitus a few times, and they're just one of the most exciting bands out there from back in the day, and today having them back is fantastic. We're going to talk about life in New York, how his band started, how he came up in the scene, and I can't wait to talk to him, so we're going to get him on the screen right now. Thanks everybody for joining us on this lovely Sunday evening. All right, I'm gonna wait for the internet to work its magic here, and he should be on screen momentarily. And if you want to watch past episodes, you can check them out on YouTube. They're all on YouTube. Ritchie!
Hey Chris, how's it going?
It's going well, man. How are you?
I'm good. Apologies to you and to everyone else about that debacle earlier in the week, but yeah, it was without power for days, so we had to hoof it back to New York, but now we're back. We're back in
Connecticut,
in,
huh?
in the nutmeg state, holding it down.
Nice. Well, hey, no worries. That was an issue for many people. Still is, I think. It was a brutal one.
It's really brutal. A lot of people still don't have power in this state. So,
well, welcome to Age of Quarantine. This is a show that I started back in March, and we have the archives on YouTube, and a lot of great episodes, everybody, that you can check out and go back to. And this one will be up for everybody to check out that doesn't get to catch the whole thing. So,
nice.
Ritchie, yeah, absolutely. It's been a lot of fun, man.
Yeah, I haven't seen you since our little mini tour together. It's great to see your face again.
Thanks, man.
Wish it could be in person.
Me too. I can't believe that was a year ago. How times have changed.
Yeah, insane.
Absolutely. So how have you been managing to get through this crazy time?
It's been rough. I have a couple of young kids, and my daughter was, she was excited this year to graduate 5th grade and, to do the school musical and a lot of other things that she missed out on. And listen, not complaining, because a lot of people were affected a hell of a lot worse than we were. But it's just strange being a father and knowing that your kids are growing up, in the time of a plague. It's like, it's heavy, and not to mention all the other, the other shit we're living through. We're basically living in a dystopian graphic novel, or maybe we crossed into a parallel universe or something. But so it's been great to spend more time with my immediate family, and to just like cook with them more, and go on hikes with them. But it's also really weird. It's
Right.
super weird.
Yeah, I bet. And it's all, I totally feel you. I have a niece that I just explained that to, why we had to stay 6 feet apart and why we couldn't hug each other and all this stuff. Just such a bizarre time. Now, are you you're originally from New York, but you live in Connecticut now?
No, I still live in New York. We just, my wife's family have a home here, and we spend a lot of time in the summer here, and a lot of weekends during the rest of the year. No, I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, same neighborhood I lived in when I was going to high school, and at this time I live in my own place, but my mom's still around the corner. So But yeah, I'm a Manhattanite.
That's amazing. I can't believe that you've been there all your life. It's so rare. I mean, I feel like a lot of people leave. Like I interviewed Roger, and he lives in Arizona now, and all these guys that bounce around because of how different the city is. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like growing up there for you, and maybe elaborate on what the vibe and environment was like for you back in the day?
Yeah, I mean, look, everyone sort of looks at the past through rose-colored glasses and romanticizes the era they grew up in. But even that being said, it was a very special time to be going to high school in the early '80s, and on like a Wednesday night, when I was a junior in high school, I could go down to the Peppermint Lounge and see the Cramps, after like the Gun Club opened for them. And then,
Oh,
and also at that time when I was in high school, before I got into playing hardcore, I was always into a lot of different kinds of music. But even really before, hardcore really sort of kicked off in earnest, I was into a lot of other stuff. When I was very, very young, I was going to clubs. I was going to the Mud Club in Max's Kansas City for the brief time that Max's Kansas City existed. The first hardcore show I went to was in '81 at Max's, and it was the Bad Brains and the very different Beastie Boys.
Yeah.
And but I was, it was an incredible, every week I'd get the Village Voice, and on any given week I'd go to 3 or 4 shows. I was obsessed with music, and even on school nights I would, much to the chagrin of my mother, I would stay out till all hours, and I'd go see like Pulsa Llama or any number of rockabilly and psychobilly bands and post-punk bands, and it was really exciting. And then when hardcore started, and I really got into hardcore because it just seemed like, I was really into punk because I had a friend of my older brother's, and in the late '70s turned me onto the Ramones and the Clash, and I was always looking for something even more kind of raw, and even that felt even more outside of the mainstream. And so it was just sort of a natural progression. I was always just looking for that other branch of subculture, and I always felt like a fringy and everything. I guess the only thing I ever really immersed myself in for a time, because I was in like a rockabilly band, was that. So I had like the New Nile in my hair, and like the Creepers and the Peg Slacks, and
Yeah.
and all that stuff when while I was going through puberty. Yeah, so I was just always drawn to sort of subculture and underground stuff. So it was just a natural progression. And then when I heard that there was a movement of music where people weren't even on like actual record labels, and you'd go to I'd go to these places like A7, and there'd be like 50 people in a room going berserk to this music, and it's like, wow, no one even really knows about this.
Right.
This is almost like a secret. It's so cool. And obviously it became something much bigger. But yeah, so growing up in New York, and particularly in that decade in the '80s, was just wild. It was a very, very different place. It was more dangerous. It was more raw. It had so much more of that ethos, that New York
Mm-hmm.
ethos that existed in the '70s and in the '80s, and that now to even get glimpses of that, you have to, like, you got to stream like Taxi Driver or something. It's
I was
just
gonna say Taxi Driver, the Warriors, that kind of thing.
yeah, Warriors.
Yeah.
Warriors. Yeah, I mean, like Baseball Furies and the Turnbull ACs. I'd see those guys all the time, like running around.
Unbelievable.
No, that's a joke. But yeah. But no, but you would, like I remember in like 9th and 10th grade, and you'd hear from people, they'd be like, my older brother was telling me about a gang called the Savage Skulls in the Bronx, and if you go to the Bronx and you're not in the Savage Skulls, you'll die. It's like just
Unreal, man.
a lot of
Well,
mythology about.
and those A7 shows, like some of the is that
No,
you?
don't worry about that. Yeah, someone else will
Okay,
get it. Sorry.
no worries. The clubs that you mentioned, the shows would start at regular time, but A7, those shows started super late. So,
Yeah.
I'm sure that was kind of interesting as a teenager for
Actually, it wasn't just A7. All the club. I mean, like I wasn't joking. I remember the night before I took my SATs. I think I went to see the Cramps that night, and I don't think they hit the stage till after 1 a.m.
Wow.
That was really common at places like the Peppermint Lounge or the Mud Club. Yeah, headlining bands would often come on.
And how old are you when this is happening? When we saw the Cramps?
I started going to clubs when I was like 14. And when I was
Wow.
15, my friends and I, when we were 15, we just knew everyone in all the clubs. So we'd sit in like the VIP section at Peppermint Lounge, or I spent a lot of time at Danceteria when I was a kid in the 80s. There was a cool thing in the later years of Danceteria, there was a thing called Wuthering Heights up on the roof, or like a balcony. But yeah, and I also was like a late bloomer. So when I was like 14, 15 years old, I looked like I was 11. So it was just, but clubs were different then. A lot of people didn't get carded. If they knew you, they let you in. And yeah, it was, I graduated high school in 83. And by that time, I'd been to so many clubs in New York and including after hours clubs.
Right.
I grew up pretty quickly. Yeah.
Super fascinating. I grew up going to shows in the mid '90s, which is when I discovered Into Another. So it was still like some glimpses, but not as gentrified as it is today. I always love hearing from people like you about those experiences. And how did you find other kids to hang out with and go to shows with?
Yeah, so it's weird. I grew up on the Upper West Side, and I went to high school on the Upper West Side, so I was kind of detached from that world. I was always drawn to downtown. Even, I have two older brothers. I had an older my eldest brother when he was going to NYU. He had a place downtown, and so I had cause to go down and visit him there. When I was really into skateboarding, and often I would literally skate from the Upper West Side down to Washington Square Park or down to Brooklyn Bridge Banks, or I was always exploring downtown. I think every young person in New York at that time was drawn to the Village and the East Village and just downtown culture. And but I found the first sort of hardcore people I found when I was going to McBurney High School. Adam Horowitz, who was in The Young and the Useless at that time, was in my homeroom, and he gave me and we were friends, and he gave me a copy of the Young and the Useless 7-inch. And,
wow.
I had maybe gone to like, one or two hardcore shows, and I just started. I remember going to see them play a few times, and I became close with the singer Dave Skilkin, and then I would just start hearing about shows, and then it's just like you just start seeing the same people, and like you just go to shows and you see people and you strike up conversations. I remember the reason I first started talking to Russ Igley before we were in a band together was because he was the only other guy I would see at shows with a skateboard. Maybe there were others, but I always noticed him on a skateboard. So we would see each other at shows and we would talk.
And that's Russ from Underdog. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's just like you go to your first show and you go again, and you're going to see the same faces. It was a relatively small scene, and you just you just vibe with certain people. And
yeah, also super, like, even more special back then. Now you have skate parks everywhere, and a lot of people walk around with weird hair, but back then you see somebody, I'm sure it's like.
I remember, especially on the East Coast, it was such a, you had to really like seek it out. I remember going to Rat Cage on Avenue A, and it was like literally underground. It was like below grade, and it was just like this amazing place. And Dave Rat Cage would come out and like in a dress, and I remember buying like my like a Neil Blender deck and Trucks and Wheels there, and I remember, and Thrasher, I subscribed to Thrasher, and I remember when it was on like newsprint, and you'd see these, the people in these zines were like gods because you so rarely saw them. And
Right.
I remember, like, fast forward years, the band that became Underdog, we were called the Numbskulls for a while, and we played a show with a few bands at CB's at a matinee, and then the Faction were on the bill. I think Government Issue headlined, and the Faction.
Wow.
And I remember being so starstruck when I saw like Steve Caballero like getting out of a van. And like, I was literally, like dumbstruck. I couldn't even like think of what to say to him. I was just like, that's Steve Caballero. He's at CB. He's like on the Bowery, and yeah, it was kind of.
And I wanted to ask you too, like how did Underdogs? Well, let me ask you two questions. Let's start with this. What hardcore bands or hardcore and punk rock bands had the biggest impact on you, and then talk about how Underdog started.
So, I mean, I guess not only because they were the first band I saw, but for obvious reasons that we all know, that the Bad Brains had a huge. I never heard music with that energy, or that. I think seeing the Bad Brains for the first time, I just thought this is the most unique thing I think I've ever experienced in my life. Yeah. But there were New York bands that that really just it's weird. Like, I'm gonna just go sideways here for a second, but
sure.
I think one of the worst things about the world being just so connected and everything unfolding in real time and everything being a global village is you don't get like regional culture anymore. The way that like the Stooges sound like Detroit, or
right.
or Blue Cherry MC5, or like the Ramones sound like New York. And there were New York hardcore bands, obviously Agnostic Front, and then a little later, like 84ish, 83, 84ish, Murphy's Law and the Cro-Mags, those bands in particular for me. I mean, like, I'm into a lot of music, a lot of genres. I've seen a lot of unbelievable shows in arenas and in small clubs, and I've seen some of my favorite, most iconic rock star bands. Take your pick. And at that time, going to see, seeing Jimmy G on stage, or Harley and Blood Clot on stage at that time. I mean, they were at least, they had at least as much presence and more sort of ferocity and energy, and the vibe was just so intense in those days. I mean, like, it sounds so silly to say, but going in at CB's and being there, being up front, or being in the pit when like Murphy's Law was playing Sit Home and Rot, and like all their friends are on stage, and it's Joe Bruno, and like you don't know where the crowd ends and the band begins, or vice versa. I mean, like, even now I get goosebumps thinking about that vibe, like what that was like. Or when the Cro-Mags would come out on stage, like it was literally just as intense for me when the lights would go down and the Cro-Mags would come out, and you knew they were about to play We Gotta Know, or,
right.
as being at like the Garden, and, AC/DC is going to come out, and you hear the bell going and the lights go down. And it's like, and not just, and it was so much more, right? Because it was this underground, do-it-yourself, homemade scene. And you were like, and also you were proud that the darkest, most menacing hardcore, and even Murphy's Law, who were like fun and jovial, they were like pure fun. Even that music, had this streak to it that was just like menacing and dark and awesome. Yeah. And you were like proud that like this is what New York hardcore sounds like. I also loved the more like cerebral, obviously like DC hardcore, and I loved the equally dark Ann Arbor Negative Approach vibes, and I loved all the West Coast stuff. I loved the Germs and Black Flag, and
I mean, you got to live through it. This is stuff that we fantasize about today. Even, I'm not a super young dude myself, but I missed out on all that. And, all my friends and I, we'll go see different versions of these bands now. But what you got to see back then is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I guess, maybe the only perk of being ancient is like, it's so funny. I sound like, when my dad used to say to me that, like, you'd go to the cinema and it was, it cost, less than the price of a pack of chewing gum now, and you'd get, it's just like, I feel like just such an old man when I talk about this stuff, but it was an incredibly special time. And downtown, it's funny because we all like to think that, and to a degree, it's very true. We live in a much more, the present administration aside, and the totally insane, like 30% of this country aside, we do live in a much more tolerant country, right? There's still rampant, intolerance and discrimination, but when I was a kid, even if like someone in popular culture came out as gay, their career ended. It was like, or could, when I was very young. And so we live in a hopefully, after this weird aberration of this Trump era, will continue to like make advancements. But I have to say that time in New York, downtown New York was this, it was almost like this island of misfit toys. Like there were a lot of different factions of people, and honestly, for the most part, there was a lot of, I mean, like I worked at the Pyramid Club. I DJ'd there. I did the door there. I even did security with Ray B's and with Jimmy there. And you're talking about a club that, on Sunday nights, it was all drag. It was like a gay night. You'd have me and Jimmy and Ray B's working there. Everybody, like, not only getting along, but everyone, like just having each other's backs. And it was, I actually saw a lot more genuine kind of tolerance and intermingling of people back then in that scene downtown than I do now. I hear a lot of people paying a lot of lip service to a lot of stuff, but you look at, how they spend their lives and who they spend their lives with and whom they tolerate,
Right.
and whom they don't. And it's, yeah. So it was an incredible period that just sort of flared up. It kind of started to die in the late 80s, like around the time of the Tompkins Square riots. I mean, you mentioned gentrification. Obviously, that's one factor. But
Hey, Richie, the volume went down a little bit.
oh, sorry.
Oh, it's better now. That's
weak
good.
network here. I mean, to me, I was saying it kind of feels like that period, that very special period. And by the way, if I talk about like the old days and put everything on a pedestal, I by no means am saying like everything sucks now or everything sucked.
Oh, no, not at all. I mean,
at all.
it's really important,
It's just, for me, that was, the 80s is when like I started playing in bands and I started discovering all this stuff, and it was like those were very formative years for me, and I realized how incredibly special every decade is for everybody. But it just seems like we think of the past as just being this like draconian, intolerant era, and there was a lot of open-mindedness and there were a lot of forward-thinking, tolerant, cool people in
yeah.
that scene.
Yeah. And the city obviously had a lot to do with being one of the first places to have those types of subcultures before they were even acceptable anywhere else. So there's a lot to be said about that. In terms of Underdog, because I want to get from there into another though, because
Sure.
and Youth of Today, there's a lot to cover here.
Yeah.
But how did Underdog correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Underdog kind of around the same time that Murphy's Law and some of the bands you mentioned were happening?
Well, yeah. So Underdog. Well, we didn't put out our first EP until '85,
Okay.
but Underdog sort of existed in iterations too. I mean, before we were called Underdog, we were called True Blue, and that was the same lineup with me and Russ. And then before that, it was the Numbskulls, which was a band that like one of my best friends from high school and I started. He went on to play in an underground band, a non-hardcore band, a band called Surgery. but he and I started the Numbskulls with a guy called George who played bass, who used to have a thing called the Misfits Glee Club, where everyone would get together and sing Misfit songs, like a cappella. But yeah, so I mean, that all started, like the whole Numbskulls thing and everything. The genesis of it was sort of 82ish, when I was a senior in high school, and then we recorded a couple of demos, one of which got sort of circulated on cassette in like 83 or 84, Numbskulls. And Numbskulls was just sort of like when we could get everyone together, because like one of us was going to Syracuse University, and we were all sort of spread around, and but that's what turned into Underdog. In fact, a lot of Numbskulls songs are Underdog songs. And so yeah, I mean, but the first Underdog, that first 7-inch is 85.
Underdog was such an original band for, around the hardcore scene back then. A lot of bands either sounded like Minor Threat or SSD, or I mean, you guys had reggae songs and dub songs, but that was quite common for other, not just Bad Brains, but Murphy's Law and other bands.
Right.
Really original, and really amazing playing, which was also, people, I don't think you guys get enough credit for that. A lot of the hardcore bands earlier on didn't have that kind of the chops, and you guys had a guitar player that could shred, an amazing bass player, and then of course you're singing. Now, when did Youth of Today enter your life, and why did you, what made you want to play guitar in a band when you already were a singer of a band?
Yeah, no, very good questions. So the way that started was, it's funny saying this, because when I sort of like did things other than hardcore after Underdog, like with Into Another, there were a million influences, and among them was a sort of like harder rock and like metal influences and things. But I remember being, when I didn't like my hardcore like too metal, and I remember I was invited. Someone told me, and it's funny, because I'd seen like Capo around, around the scene a few times, and I'd even seen Purcell one or two times. And I used to go to shows all over. I used to go to shows in Connecticut, and I remember Violent Children and all that. Anyway, I remember on the day of this show, someone said to me, "Hey, you want to come see this band that's playing with AF? They're like a throwback." It's funny because the difference between 83 and 85 is like decades back then, and someone was like, "They're like a throwback to 82. You got to hear this. They're just like this raw, like, purest hardcore band." And I went to the show, and I was absolutely blown away. And that description was spot on. And this is at the time when a lot of hardcore bands were starting to get really metal, right? And then
Crossover.
Yeah, and here comes Youth of Today, and it's just like, thrash part, mosh part, just like, and yeah, and also it appealed to me too, because I didn't drink and I didn't do drugs, and I don't know, I just remember the second I saw them, I was like, this, on the one hand, is this like trying to be like something that already happened, or is this feels like something new? Yeah. And anyway, that night I spent a ton of time talking with Ray and Purcell, and we just became very fast friends, like instant friends. I mean, like not long after that, I was like hanging out with them, like in Connecticut and up in Westchester, and they were coming to the city. And not long after that, Purcell was my roommate. He moved. I had an apartment on Thompson Street with a friend of mine, another friend of mine from high school I was in a rockabilly band with, and Purcell moved in, and we were roommates, and we were spending so much time together, and Capo and I were going to like get like free prasadam on Greenwich Avenue and listen to like, and so yeah, we just rapidly became very, very close friends, and
lifelong friends too.
Oh, lifelong friends, absolutely. I mean, those guys are such a huge part of my life, and I love those guys, and so yeah, I remember I tried to do both bands. I remember once just talking with Purcell, and I was like, you know, when I first started playing in bands, I played guitar. I played guitar in that rockabilly band. I would sing a few songs, but I was the guitar player. And
What was the name of that band?
we were called the Bel Airs, you know, like the Chevy Bel Air, you know,
Yeah, yeah. Is
with
there
the
anything
hyphen.
of that online anywhere?
No, no. I mean,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, we were kids. I mean, I don't know. I don't think so. And there were other, of course, there were other bands called that, but we had some cool shows. We played with, you know, we did get to open for the Cramps. We actually played with Carl Perkins
Wow.
at the Mud Club, which was
That's crazy.
incredible.
You've
But
lived some life, man.
you know,
Unbelievable.
I don't know. But yeah, so Youth of Today happened just because I was really close friends with those guys, and Purcell and I were roommates, and he's like, you should come on tour. And I was like, you know, I'd love to play guitar. It was kind of like just like a reason to tour with them. But I ended up making an album with them and recorded Break Down the Walls with them. I even,
Not just an album, a very landmark album.
yeah, it's kind of
Legendary.
a seminal album in that whole sort of second wave of straight edge and in hardcore in general. It's one of the, it's a, yeah, I'm so honored to have been like a small part of that. I mean, and I got to like co-write a couple of riffs and stuff and recording it. I mean, we had so much fun recording that. I can't tell you. I mean, Drew and I were, you know, Drew's like my little brother. We met when he was in Crippled Youth, and same thing, became like really fast friends, and he and I became extremely just extremely close friends.
Love Drew.
Similarly,
That's Drew
yeah,
Thomas, who
yeah.
ended up in Boulder. Luke from Gorilla Biscuits also wanted to mention that you had a bitchin' Kramer back then.
Well, no, sadly, so that was to replace a late '50s Les Paul that
Okay.
that got stolen in Detroit on tour, and you know that those guitars remain to this day prohibitively expensive to replace.
Oh, I
So,
can't imagine. Yeah. But so
so
Drew, you meet Drew when you're in Youth of Today.
I met Drew before that.
Okay.
I met Drew. He was in Crippled Youth. I was in maybe what was still the Numbskulls, even before it became True Blue and then Underdog. I think I met Drew, and through those guys, through the whole like Connecticut and Westchester, you know, like
Yeah.
Danbury.
Shout out to Drew. Drew's one of the best drummers out there, and he's
He is.
also one of the most youthful guys that, like, you know, I've met so many people, but like the guy just seems, and I mean this in the nicest way, like you talk to him and it's like he just seems so youthful, you know?
Yeah, he is.
Yeah.
He has this, he keeps this portrait of himself that ages, but he doesn't, and
Yeah, exactly.
he's kind of amazing. But yeah, and to this day, he and I were incredibly close. But yeah, so that was, I tried to be in both bands for a while. I tried to do the Youth of Today thing and the Underdog thing simultaneously, but understandably, it didn't go over well with my brothers in Underdog. So
Right.
we parted ways briefly. Carl Mosher did a tour with Underdog as singer,
Okay.
which really was kind of like kind of stony for me. It was kind of weird, just
Yeah.
because some of those lyrics were really like, I mean, some of them were just, you know, whatever, just like garden variety hardcore lyrics, but some of them were really personal too. So it's just weird to think of someone, you know,
Yeah.
singing your lyrics,
And
but
also,
it
like,
happens
you
all the
know,
time. Yeah.
you're not an easy guy to replace, you know. Then again, people
Well,
replace
thanks, but
HR, which is weird.
yeah. I mean, look, you know, and Carl's an amazing frontman with the Iceman and everything, and definitely a better dancer than I am. And you know, may his soul rest in peace. I love Carl. He was a great guy.
Yeah.
Absolute New York hardcore legend.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we parted ways for a while, and then I kind of missed having the mic in my hand, and then rejoined Underdog after that summer. It was the summer of '87 where we parted ways, and I did the Break Down the Walls tour and Carl
And you
tour.
you weren't in Youth of Today for that long.
Well, only Well, there was that one full tour. There were other shorter ones, and went up to Canada with them, and played shows with like a handful of shows with 7 seconds. And I mean, I actually don't know the length of time, because there was, obviously I was in the band for a period before we recorded Break Down the Walls, and then for a period after that. So I honestly don't know. I'd have to like
Yeah.
put all the pieces together. But
We got that volume issue again.
oh,
Oh,
sorry.
there it is. It's better
So
now.
I don't know if it was a year or what it was, but yeah, not that long. I was in the band long enough to do a tour and a bunch of like outings, you know, multi-show outings, and to record and release an album. But then rejoined Underdog, did the Underdog LP.
Vanishing Point.
Yep, and lots of touring and stuff, and yeah, and then Underdog broke up in '89.
I was gonna add, that's my next
Yeah.
question. Vanishing Point is unbelievable. It's a timeless record. It's up there with all the greats.
Wow, thank you. That's,
yeah.
I appreciate
So what was the reason for the disbanding in '89?
I think it was just, you know, I mean, for me, I can't speak for everyone else. For me, it was just sort of, it just felt like a thing that had run its course, you know, like it just felt like it was time to part ways. You know, I know that I was just wanting to sort of expand my horizons musically.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I love hardcore, but I love so many kinds of music, and I was just I just really wanted to try. Even, you know, the seeds were sort of planted in my mind by me toward the end of the existence of that band, to maybe try something that without any musical preconceptions, or, you know, like and without trying to fit into any box or niche or genre.
Which happens a lot with hardcore. I mean, when you look in the history books of everybody, that whether it's Minor Threat, Fugazi, Gorilla Biscuits, Quicksand, I mean, it's kind of a natural transition. We kind of glossed over one thing here, and we have about 25 minutes left. So, and it's
Oh,
so much.
shit, sorry, I talk a lot. Yeah.
No, this is good. I always start by telling people that this is the time to tell your life story. And for anyone joining now, if you missed the first half, this will be up in full on the St. Vitus Instagram channel for anybody to watch as an archive. But when did you find your voice and realize that you could sing the way that you do? Like, at what point did that happen?
Around age 6, when I sang on the Captain Kangaroo show.
Great answer.
No, I did. Actually, it's funny. My mom, my mother is a lyricist, and she writes musicals and stuff. But before that, she wrote for children's television shows. So I started singing then. I mean, I was pretty terrible then, but that's when I started singing. I don't know that I ever felt like, hey, I've got a good voice, but I've always enjoyed it, and I started very, very young.
Very young, yeah. With actually, sounds like you started very young with everything that you've done, which is pretty awesome. That you found a lot of lanes to go in with your life. Not many people can say that. And so, okay, we got to get into another, because there's so much to talk about here. But let's start with the obvious one. You're starting to talk about Underdog breaking up and wanting to try new things. So this is kind of like a two-sided question. What were the sort of like classic rock or metal influences that you were bringing to the table? Because obviously there's a lot of that into another end, your voice.
Sure. So yeah, there are. I mean, none of it. I don't know that any of it was consciously woven in. You know, growing up, my first favorite band was the Beatles when I was, 5. And I love, all the Beatles, the Stones, Pink Floyd, the Who, all that stuff, Sabbath, Zeppelin, the Doors. I grew up on a lot of classic rock,
Right.
and you know, and I loved the more raw stuff too, and the Stooges. But I also loved like I loved like real bubblegum, almost glam. So I loved you know, like worshipped the Sweet. You know, you know,
Oh
were
yeah.
originally known as the Sweet, then Sweet, but like Desolation Boulevard and Give Us a Wink were two of the most, you know, two of my favorite albums. I remember being at sleepaway camp and I was the DJ for a day and I played Ballroom Blitz like over and over and the 7-inch. So like I grew up on a lot of just like seminal rock, a lot of British rock, absolutely worshipped. I mean, literally from the time I was 4 and first heard like Space Oddity, worshipped Bowie, and Bowie was always a
Oh
huge
fuck yeah. Are you
influence
kidding me?
lyrically. I mean, I even allude to him in an Into Another lyric where I sing, you know, I cry to Aladdin singing and all that, you know. So I don't know that, I mean, I'm sure that somewhere in the deepest recesses, like all that stuff like simmered in a pot and I pulled some influences out. I can tell you that Drew and I started Into Another, and we were very much kindred spirits in that desire to do something outside of genre or preconception or anything. And at the time, Drew and I were listening endlessly to Bowie and Queen and Sabbath and T-Rex.
Would you throw Judas Priest or Rob
So
Halford?
it's so weird you say that. So I was going to say the only person I sort of consciously and with so Drew and I used to always joke about how much this was going to, like, you know, just put off so many people, and we kind of relished that. It was weird. Like we were kind of psyched about it. And you know, I used to think of it the way that, like, and this is throwing it back to even before my time, but I was always impressed that like that Ricky Nelson could go from being this like child star to then being this kind of like bubblegum rock and roll pseudo rockabilly star to, you know, doing the song Garden Party, which is, I don't know if you know, but it's like the chorus is you can't please everyone, so you've got to please yourself. Because he totally changed and he got like hate mail and people hated on him, and there's a million examples of it, right? That's
Great
that's
quote.
just the only one. But so we used to joke about it, and I have to say I did consciously, because at the time, and I can't do it anymore, I was able to sing 3 octaves, and I was like, you know, I should do some like crazy high note Rob Halford shit, like, you know.
Is this with no training?
And well, I was always around music. You know, I grew up in a house with like my mom was playing piano all the time. I didn't have any formal musical training. I took like some banjo lessons when I was, you know, 5 or something, but that's about it. But like I got sort of informal like theory and harmony training. But Drew and I love Priest. Like I still get made fun of. I try to tell convince some friends, and I'm like, dude, you listen to Sad Wings of Destiny, like beginning to end. It's unbelievable. And they're like, nah, you know. But
Dude, I mean, there's no way. Like, it's not like rip off. I would never call it a rip off, but like I hear it. So like, especially now,
yes.
I didn't realize it at the time, but I hear it so much.
Yeah. So I mean, you can hear. I mean, there's certain Priest songs like "Run of the Mill" off, you know, Rock-a-Rolla, and all of Sad Wings, all of Sin After Sin. Like that stuff is just like ingrained in my, you know, psyche, like from the time it came out. So and I love Halford, and I love, you know, those big dramatic high notes he hit. So that, yeah, there's a lot of Priest in it.
Did you get those comparisons in the 90s when Into Another was around, or like I don't know, I don't remember reading about that so much, but
yeah, so it's weird. A few, you know, like that one, yes, I've definitely, even back then, a few people were like, "Are you a Rob Halford fan?" I'd be like, "Fuck yeah, of course," you know. Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, there are probably a ton of influences in there, right? I mean, how could there not be? And to, you know, I listen to everything passionately, and I still do. I try and fill every spare hour I can outside of like work and family with music, you know, like, and I grew up just, you know, I grew up, I never slept growing up. I just listened to music and played music, and was just immersed in it from, you know, from my earliest memories. So there are a lot of influences that bubbled out because, and again, Into Another was, the whole thesis of Into Another was you know, no constraints, like there's no genre, there's no movement, there's,
Oh
you
my
know,
God.
you may fall on your face,
Yeah.
and like, but yeah. So.
And then like you find these two guys who are not from the hardcore scene that are literally fucking, I still talk about it with my friends this day, and it's so cool to have toured with Peter and spoken to
Yeah.
him, but like it's so original. Like what the
Oh my
fuck?
God.
Where do you find these guys? Where do you find Tony
So
and
yeah,
Peter?
so Peter's now late wife, Catherine. She she was a journalist, a music journalist, and I think she was one of the editors, or maybe the editor in chief, I don't know, of one of the metal magazines, of Metal Maniacs, I think. But she used to come to tons of hardcore shows, and she was just always at shows, and I would always see her, and she'd always be like, "What are you up to now? Oh, I heard Underdog broke up." And I remember when I was telling her that Drew and I were looking for musicians to play with. She was like, "Oh, you got to hear my boyfriend play guitar." And we're like, "Oh, yeah, okay." And
Unreal.
I remember Drew and I rented like a room at some rehearsal studio, and we invited Peter in, and I brought a bass, and you know, this guy walks in with, you know, he looked like a roadie for Rush or something. He had like, you know, hair down to his waist, and like, you know, white high tops, and like maybe even acid wash jeans. And we were like, all right, you know, none of that stuff matters. Let's see if this guy can play. And I was like, you know, can we just like, so I immediately, you know, you have these like preconceptions, we all do. So you see a guy like that, you think, oh, he's going to be like some noodler who can like probably play Eruption perfectly, but he can't like jam, right?
Yeah.
Or play a song. So, you know, we sit down, I'm like, can we just play some like, you know, just like some blues in E or whatever it was, you know? And 15 seconds into him playing, Drew and I just look at each other, and our jaws just like fell open. I was like,
Dude, he's one of the best guitar players I've ever heard in my life.
right. So I know. So it sounds like hyperbole, right? Like that sounds like a hyperbolic statement. And he is easily, and I've been playing guitar my whole life, and I've been around a lot of guitar players. And there are things Peter can do with a guitar that I've never heard anybody else.
Yeah.
And I remember even for a time, for close to 7 years, I lived in LA, and I met a lot of guys and a lot of bands and a lot of guitar players, and so many of them were like, dude, I've tried so hard to do what Peter Moses does on the guitar. Like I've tried to sit down and deconstruct it, and like, you know, some guitar players I met who could play anything, who could, you know, they could like reverse engineer anything, any Van Halen lead, anything, and they were just like, you know, I think it's because Peter, it's not only his classical training, but he always was, he always played such unique voicings of chords and things, not just to be different. It was just him. It was his style. It's like
Sounds like he's from outer space sometimes.
Yeah, it's just what came out of his soul and out of his fingers. It's just very different to everybody else, you know. So.
And him and Tony were in a band called Whiplash.
Well, Tony was. Peter was not. Peter was in no bands before Into Another, which is another. Yeah, so Peter led us to Tony. He's like, my friend Tony used to play in Whiplash, and same thing with Tony. Like Tony, I mean, Tony actually wrote a lot of the music for Into Another. He actually was a huge part of all the composing that went on. And Tony, same thing, when he came in and the four of us played together, you know, Tony, to me, I mean, aside from just having the most like in the pocket meter of any bass player, and he played so like percussively, he didn't slap, I don't mean percussively that way. He played a lot of songs, he played with a pick, with a flat pick, or he played with his fingers. But he himself was like a one-man rhythm section. So you combine that with Drew, who to me is like one of the greatest drummers. It was just, he and Drew instantaneously were just locked, and just
such a tight rhythm section. Thing about Into Another is that, like, you know, obviously, you know, today the version of the band, which ironically you did find a guy that could play that stuff on guitar because you have two guitar
Yeah,
players.
that's a whole other story. The way those guys like blew our minds. Like I'm sure you've heard it from Drew, like that story. But yeah, so it wasn't until then, and that's why we thought it would never. We just could never play again. You know, for a time we couldn't find Peter, and then this 25th anniversary of Revelation was coming up, and Jordan and I started talking, and I remember thinking, first of all, you know, we can't find Peter, and you know, how are we ever going to play without Tony? Like this just can't work. You know, can't happen. And then I think it was Chris Lisk got Brian and Reed to make a video of themselves playing Into Another songs. And
what bands are they in again? Their other
so
bands.
1134 is one band. I don't know if you've heard them. They were a rad, like West Coast hardcore band. Those guys, I think, played in 1134 together.
Okay.
But they've been in a million. I mean, even now, Reed's got a band called Steakhouse that records and releases stuff. But Brian is probably best known for Ignite.
Is he still in Ignite?
He still, you know, I don't know. I know that they've done shows and done outings without him, but they've also done them with him in the time that he's been a member of Into Another. So I'm not sure of, you know.
But so anyway, so those guys you were saying.
Yeah. So they sent us. We got an email with a private link, a private YouTube link, and Drew and I like called each other and like watched them together or something, and we were like, holy shit, like these guys are playing every riff. And I have to say, like, and Drew and I have said this, you know, this lineup with those guys feels, you know, like the greatest lineup. I mean, the chemistry is just amazing. You know, obviously having Peter's guitar playing augmented by another great guitar player. And again, it was just such a vibe between all of us. Like, you know,
Yeah.
those guys are brothers to me, you know, Brian and Reed, every bit as much as Peter and Tony and Drew. So.
I want to ask a couple more questions while we have 8 minutes left. It sucks because I feel like we could keep going, but the Instagram, it just kicks you off after a while.
Okay.
But when you, I could nerd out about Ignaris and Seamless and all this stuff, and I have questions there. But can you briefly talk about, you know, the first few records were on Revelation. Can you briefly talk about how the hardcore scene reacted to Into Another, and then we could jump into kind of summarize
Sure.
the rest of,
Yeah, so we were, as expected, very polarizing. I mean, really, it actually turned out much better than expected. Drew and I used to joke that people were going to like throw shit at us. But from the very first time we started playing, I mean, our first New York show was at the Pyramid Club with like White Zombie, and
that makes sense.
A ton of hardcore kids, like tons of hardcore kids showed up. And the minute we started playing our like wacky outer space, like version of like prog metal or whatever we were, I don't even know what we were or are, these kids were going fucking bonkers. But then of course there were a ton of kids who hated us, like hardcore purists. And, you know, I've always believed in, you know, in the maxim that, you know, the opposite of hate is not love, it's indifference. So I prefer that to indifference. And I can't tell you how many people, you know, from between that first Into Another show and, you know, fast forward 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, how many people came up to me and have said, I fucking hated you guys so much. And then they'll like roll up a sleeve and there's an 11-pointed star tattoo. And they're like, you know, you know, I can recite every one of your songs that were. So, and they're still, I think we're still polarizing. There's still plenty of people who hate us. And I actually, I draw some sick pleasure from that, from being hated.
I mean, but also on the flip side, it's cool that you came from the hardcore scene and people followed you wherever you went too, which is awesome.
No, it really was. It was a real testament to the fact that, like, it, you know, as long as you're making, you know, for me, it actually reaffirmed. I never like fell out of love with hardcore as a whole, there were things about it that started to turn me off when I kind of moved on, you know, but at its essence, you know, it really speaks to what a movement of individuality it is. You know, where like people recognize, you know, like genuine, honest, you know, music and words that, you know, that are full of passion, that aren't just like banal bullshit, you know, like you're
Right,
really
right.
trying to say something. So yeah.
I mean, the first time I saw Into Another, I was with a bunch of hardcore kids, and for whatever reason, like Shift was still like, so Shift opened up for you guys, and
Awesome.
people would still, you know, I know you produced Spacesuit, which is amazing. You know, I knew a lot of hardcore kids that loved Shift because it's kind of sounded like Quicksand. It had that kind of groove to it. And then you guys went on. This is at Irving, and I grew up on metal before I found out about hardcore. I immediately loved it, but I had like two hardcore friends that were kind of like snobby about it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, dude, this is sick. Like, these guys can play. They're ripping up there.
That's awesome.
So we got 5 minutes left. You know, Ignorus is one of my favorite records of all time. Seamless is my absolute favorite, and Omens was a great return. Can you just talk about what that period was like when you landed a major label deal and you had some radio playing, you were at MTV? I think you recorded Seamless with the same dude that did 10 by Pearl Jam, right?
Yeah, I mean that was such a weird time because first of all, that everything that went into the release of that album on Hollywood Records, like you could not